Throughout the semester, you're going to be looking in detail at the various parts of the Old Testament, but in this video, I just want to give you a bird's eye view of everything that happens throughout the Old Testament. So, we're going to take a quick glance at some of the major events within the Old Testament, as well as some of the major characters that we find within it. So, the Old Testament is predominantly the story of one nation, and this is the nation of Israel. This was the group of people that God had chosen to reveal himself to the world through. So, God had a special relationship with these people, and it was through this relationship that he wanted to show the world that he was the one true God. So, we'll start from the beginning with creation. And this consists of the story or the history that God, a God that is outside of space and time, a God that is all powerful, all personal, all knowing, this God creates a world out of nothing. So he not only creates this world in a 7-day account that you find in Genesis, but he creates man and he places him in a garden, and it's a perfect setting. It's where there is no sin, no brokenness, no, not much of, well, nothing bad as you would have it. But man and the counterpart, woman, that God made for man, they disobey God, and so they are cast out of the garden, and we then we come into the world that we know it, a world that is beautiful and is good, but has been broken, and there's so a lot that goes in that there is now sin that has been introduced into the world. And so this resulted in a need for a restored relationship between God and his creation of man. And so what this led to is what you'll find through a lot of the rest of the Old Testament, this attempt for restoration between God and man. And we don't see that until the New Testament. So this restoration project, you could call it, it is happening through various leaders that God selects through within His people Israel, and so the goal the whole time is for this restoration to take place, for God and man to be back in in rightness together, for things to be back okay in their relationship. So Adam and Eve had children, and the earth began to be populated. But then we come to the flood. So as the population grew, the people didn't get closer to God. They grew farther and farther away from God, except for one man and his family, and that was Noah. And so God told Noah to build an ark, or a very large boat, and to save his family and two of every kind of animal. And once they were on this boat, once Noah had built it and he got his family and the animals on the boat, God sent a worldwide flood. And the reason he did this was to start over. The people were getting more and more sinful, more and more farther away from him, and so his solution was to send a flood. But that it didn't work out super well. It wasn't the perfect solution, and so it didn't fix the problem. Even after the flood, even as as the earth was repopulated, the people became more and more selfish and brutal and kind of closed in on themselves. Rather than looking to God, they were looking within themselves. So, as another solution, God confused their language. At that time, they were all speaking one language, and the goal of the Tower of Babel was that they were going to become more powerful and they were going to build a tower into the sky. And so, God confused their language, and as a result, they started to spread out into various communities. So then, coming to a very important person from the Old Testament, we come to Abraham. God identified this man. He lived in Mesopotamia, or what we would say near Kuwait. And God made this man a promise. He promised Abraham that his descendants would be numerous, and that they would have a land of their own, and that they would be their own nation. And this was a huge promise, because at the time that God promises Abraham this, he is already pretty old, and his wife was barren. And so a big promise that this is what God was going to have for Abraham's future. And through this marks the beginning of the Israelite people. So Israel is the descendant of Abraham. So God spoke to Abraham's sons, Isaac, Jacob, who was later renamed Israel, and Joseph. And then we also have that Abraham's son Ishmael is where Judaism and Islam part ways. And so not only is Abraham a major character, but also his family line. He's kind of the starting point for all of this. Then we come to Joseph. So Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So Joseph would have been the grandson of Abraham. Through a long story that you will learn more about, Joseph was sold into slavery into nearby Egypt. So he went to live in Egypt, and he ended up growing up as pretty much the right-hand man of Pharaoh. So, as I said, long story short, which you will read about later, Abraham and his family ended up moving to Egypt, and this was due to a famine in their homeland. So Abraham ended up dying in Egypt, and the family continued to stay, and eventually Joseph died. So then many, many years pass, and a new Pharaoh came to rule who did not remember Joseph and did not remember his good relationship with the Israelites. By this time, Abraham's family was very, very large. They had turned into a nation living in their own area in Egypt. But this Pharaoh did not want to continue this good relation with them. He wanted to rule over them. And so the Egyptians enforced birth control, they enslaved the Israelites, and they put them to work. And this lasted for a few centuries of this being ruled over by the Egyptian people. So now coming to Moses, he was a man who had been raised in the Pharaoh's palace. And once again, long story short, you'll read about this. But he was raised in the palace, and he was Hebrew. He didn't always know that he was not Egyptian, but he discovered that he was Hebrew, and he ended up killing an Egyptian when he saw that this Egyptian man was beating one of the Hebrew slaves. But then he fled, feeling bad for what he had done. And God spoke to him in a burning bush and told him to lead his people out of slavery. So remember, his people are being ruled over by the Egyptians. And so through many crazy events, this happens through 10 plagues that God sends upon the Egyptian people. And Moses ends up leading the people across the Red Sea, or through the Red Sea, into the desert. And so it was then in the desert that Moses receives the 10 Commandments from God, and is the nation of Israel is given a leader. First and foremost, the leader is God, but then also Moses is a leader to the people, and the people are given a law through this. They're given a rule of life, a way that they should live. But then they needed land to fulfill that promise that God had given Abraham. And so they wandered for many, many years, for 40 years, and Moses actually never got to live in the promised land. But then we come to the Canaan conquest, and so going into the promised land was delayed because the people had been disobedient, and so as I said, Moses didn't get to go into the promised land, but after Moses came Joshua, and he was the new leader of the Israelites. And it was through Joshua that the Israelites were able to conquer and to go into this land they had been promised. And so this happened through an invasion that they went into Canaan and they took over the land, but they didn't fully take it over. They didn't completely drive out the Canaanites, and they always had problems along the coast. So then Joshua reapportioned the land into 12 tribes. And so now they are a nation. God has fulfilled his promises to Abraham. And the people were to be ruled by God. They were supposed to live by the law, and they were supposed to be God's people and be governed by God ultimately. And so God had prophets that he spoke through to the people. But then the people decided that they wanted to have their own human king, just like all of the nations that surrounded them. And so God chose David, but the people ended up choosing Saul. So Saul, being not the king that God preferred, things eventually didn't work out for him. He was killed in battle with the Philistines, which was the same war where David kills Goliath. And then finally, David becomes king, and he had his blemishes, but David was a great king. And from then on, all other kings were compared to King David. But then coming to David's son, Solomon was the one to build the temple. And the temple then becomes the center of Jewish life. It is where God and man come together. It's where God's presence is made known to the Israelites. And so it was Solomon who built this temple. But then after Solomon, his two sons were not good rulers of the people. And so then, due to bad leadership and due to these overbearing taxes, the nation splits into two. You have Israel making up the northern 10 tribes with Samaria as the capital, and then Judah being the southern 2 tribes with Jerusalem as the capital. So things go from them being a one unified nation to then becoming split, and things not going so well. And then finally, Israel gets conquered. Assyria conquers the area in 722 BCE and carries off the northern kingdom. So these people are carried off into exile. And then Babylon conquers Assyria, and there's the deportation, the exile. And the temple eventually gets destroyed. And so as you can see, things are not going well. The population of Judah was probably around 75,000 people, and it seems that the main cities were destroyed where some of the more rural areas were left alone. And so there was a pretty big chunk of the population that was in exile in Babylon. And this lasted for several decades until Persia conquered Babylon and allowed some, not all, of the Israelites to return to rebuild Jerusalem. And so they are able to return and actually rebuild the temple. This is the second temple, and it was completed in 516 BCE. And then that's when we come to the period of about 400 years where nothing happens, where there's silence between God and man, and then that leads into the New Testament. So this just hits the high points of the Old Testament. It is just, as I said, a bird's eye view. You will look into more of each aspect of this story, but I think it can be helpful to see kind of where you're going. And so this provides you with kind of a wide lens of what is to come.